If we start now with the first procedure, and how we'll work is as I do each of the sections of the agenda, we'll stop and ask for any questions at the end of that procedure, so you can hold them till the end of that actual section, and we'll try to answer your questions and move through the presentation. So the ministry released the guideline, Community Planning and Partnership Guideline. And basically it's encouraged school boards to reach out to community organizations to share planning information with community organizations and municipalities. Really important to know that when we talk about community organizations, that includes all municipalities, Tier 1 and Tier 2 municipalities. The ministry has asked us to consult with a broader range, not only but calling them community organizations with respect to the process. So we are talking municipalities when we talk about this as well. And this is to assist boards in establishing more facility partnerships and to add support and effective planning for community organizations. So it's really a sharing of information between the municipalities and different child care organizations or local health networks, community hubs, and to know what space is available and where the board is going with certain schools in certain direction, but also for the board to know what needs are out there. So we're trying to open up the dialogue between the two organizations, or the organizations and the school boards. The guideline is intended to reduce operating costs for school boards and the government, so again, the use of infrastructure, improve services and supports to the students, so hopefully there's a win-win for our students when we do have partnerships or collaborations in our buildings, strengthen relationship between school boards and community organizations and the public. We want to be more transparent. We want to share with the public what's going on, where the information, how we're dealing with accommodation, and we want to be more transparent with respect to that, so we're hoping this will help that. The government's hoping it will affect that. Again, maximize the use of public infrastructure, and lastly, provide a foundation to improve service delivery to communities. And I think that speaks to the community hubs and all the discussions around the community hubs that the ministry is now working with. One of the community objectives is through the planning process, the board will forecast new schools, additions, schools that are well or underutilized, and schools that have to be consolidated or closed. We have to determine the suitability of facility partnerships. So the ministry is saying to us in this guideline, you've got to develop the type of partnerships you want to put into your schools with respect to the new construction and unused space. So either co-build opportunities or the use of surplus spaces. We have to share this planning information with our community partners about the opportunities available to us, but we have to also continue to follow Ontario, the regulation to dispose of property, which is Ontario legislation of circulating it to certain entities. So it doesn't allow us to change any of the rules with respect to the disposition of property that we currently have to follow. We are developing our own policies to identify. So the first one, we have the principles and criteria regarding to eligible partners. We have to clearly state where we see the partnerships and what the partners have to bring to the table. How available space is to be selected. We have to set the criteria in which we'll decide where the space is available and actually promote it to the community organizations. What entities will be selected for the notification? Again, who are we going to notify? How are we going to put that list together? How potential partners will be notified, as well as how entities will be selected for partnership. So this is all what the ministry has put in the guideline that we're required to do now with respect to our discussions to open up the dialogue. But they are subject to the following requirements. We can't, the health and safety of students must be protected, that arrangements are appropriate for the school, that they're the proper partnerships with the school, must not compromise the student achievement at the school. We can't affect student programming with any partnerships or collaboration we have in our building. And we're not allowed to partner with any private schools or private colleges or non-publicly funded education. They cannot be put as one of our partners, so we're not allowed to partner with them. And that's, again, from the ministry guidelines. Again, the notification list has expanded. We're basically dealing with the entities that we circulate the properties to, which is basically the coterminous boards, the provincial government, the federal government, University of Western Ontario, Fanshawe College, local municipalities. But they also have expanded to the applicable district service, social service administrators, as well as consolidated managers and service managers. Applicable boards of health are now included in our list that we are to talk to, as well as local health integration networks and children mental health centers we have to consult with respect to our space. Child care operators are also to be added with respect to our notification list and our annual meeting list, as well as any other entity that approaches the board that we deem desirable to communicate with. So with this new guideline, we're required to have an annual meeting with these people and with these organizations. And we're to talk about a portion or the whole board capital plans. We're to lay out exactly what our accommodation plans will be. We want to talk to them about schools that are eligible for partnerships that we have space in. And we have other relevant information that we would share between the partners about upgrowing growth situations or other needs within the community that we may not know about, and hopefully we'll get that through the annual meeting process. Now, as we move away from that annual meeting, another requirement in this procedure, or this guideline, is that before the board does an ARC, or suggests it starts the ARC process, and that's the two guidelines and the two procedures are kind of tied together with respect to this process, is that we have to go back to the affected organizations, the municipalities and community organizations, and have discussions with them saying that the board is now moving towards an actual ARC, a consolidation of schools, and have that discussion with them to make them aware of that. So that, again, the board will then again ask, do they have any new information for us? Are there any new community partnerships that potentially are available? Or do they have any other technical information that we may not be aware of before we actually approach the board, or before the board actually approves the commencement of an ARC? And again, it's a check-in that something may have happened in the course of the annual meeting till the time that we introduce the ARCs, that some new information or some new opportunity presents itself. And the ministry wants to make sure that we've thoroughly researched any possibility that could be going on in those schools, and have that information available to the trustees prior to making a decision if they want to continue with an ARC process. With respect to co-build opportunities, and this is where we have community organizations or municipalities that want to build with us. We're building a new school and they want to build pools or recreation centers, community hubs, daycares. Boards are expected to notify the list of entities, and again, going back to the list we just talked about, municipalities and so on and so forth, 1 to 3 years of potential construction start dates. So we have to give them as much notice as possible, and you'll see that later on in the procedure, how we're going to be doing that. We do not have to have an identified source of funding to notify them, and neither do they, but we have to make them aware that the ministry will be required to have that before we sign any type of formal agreements. And the plan to build any of this is always contingent on the board's decision going forward. But it's really just searching out any opportunities, again, and not to miss an opportunity where we are building or constructing an addition, major renovations, or a new school, and a community organization or a municipality also have the thought of doing something, and together we could build more efficiently, effectively, and save not only money but also offer a better consolidated service to the community. The boards are to, with respect to these co-build opportunities, we're to evaluate the expression of interest of each partner. So we do have to, investigate to ensure that the use is compliant and it fits into our overall strategy. We cannot finalize agreements until both the board and the community partner has a source of funding secured. And this is an important point, one that's a little bit new to the process for us, is the ministry prefers the board and the community organization to have ownership of their respective portions of the building. In a lot of ways, in the past, we have built and actually leased the space back and so on and so forth. It's a little more complicated, but they're actually hoping that we can actually set up land deals and so on and so forth, where you own your building and the land, and we own our building and land, and it's definitely identified as two different entities. And that takes a little more creative, legal work and zoning work, but it is something that the ministry prefers the board to do rather than the lease opportunity, the lease back opportunity. So we'll be doing that. Going forward with the community organizations, the boards are to review annually underutilized and open operating facilities. Starting with facilities that are underutilized by 60% or have 200 pupil places, unused for 2 years. The pupil place is, with respect to the capacity of the school, the ministry rates our schools as to what the schools can hold, a number of pupil places that are using set criteria. So it's really our enrollment times their criteria of the number of kids the building would hold. If that is over 200, we're to identify that to the organizations as a possibility of the location for a partnership. But there is a caveat to that. That's as long as the board doesn't have any potential use for it. For instance, we'll be talking about holding zones and holding schools. Although the school may have space, we have designated that space in the future to be used for something else, and we have to make sure we're aware of that. But any school that we don't have a plan for, so to speak, we were to circulate to the entities that we've talked about to see if anybody's interested in a collaboration or opportunity there. With respect to the partnership agreements, if we go forward with one, we do have to create agreements with the rights and responsibilities of the as tenants, so we have to make sure that everybody understands their role and responsibility. The boards are not, and this is an important one, not expected to take on any additional costs. So this is a cost recovery proposal. We are to increase our expenditures at a building for a tenant or a collaboration. Fees charged to the partner to cover all operation and capital costs. So again, we determine that cost, and that has to be upfront. And co-build partners are required to pay and finance their share of the construction, including the shared areas that potentially we'd be sharing vestibules or parking lots, that type of thing. It all has to be calculated and shown that they are paying their fair share with respect to any co-build opportunities. It's not on the back of the board or the ministry with respect to this collaboration. This is a guideline, and we'll stop now for questions, particularly on this one, but this is a guideline that's new to the ministry. I think it's in response to the concern that the broader community sector, public sector, as well as municipalities and the boards are not communicating. They're not sharing information. They're not working together. They're basically forcing the boards and those organizations we just talked about to share information, plan together, because it is all public money, public dollars, and make sure that if there is opportunities out there that they're not missed. That's either through the annual meeting, pre-notice of the ARC, or again throughout the year if there's any other opportunities come forward. So again, using this guideline, we've developed a procedure which we'll talk about in a minute. But again, these are the requirements set down by the ministry for the board to follow with respect to, again, the community organizations, which includes municipalities. Is there any questions on that guideline? Yes.
Definitely a good idea to see different government entities and public bodies working together. Is the province or the ministry going to ensure that the money, the funding frameworks and formulas will actually allow these different entities to work together? I know school boards in particular are running under tight guidelines of how they have to spend their money. Is the province making sure that money is going to be targeted towards actually achieving this?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can speak for the ministry or the government, but I would say to you there's been a lot of discussion with the community hub. I know for a fact that the ministry has appointed a task force on it. That in discussions with the ministry, there is a lot of discussion about how to do that and asking school boards their input on how to go about securing these partnerships and what it really means for the school boards. I think the one thing that, and it is cost recovery, and they make sure the boards are aware of that, but that's always a stumbling block. Lots of good ideas and no money. So I think that's something that the ministry has to bring, but it's not just the ministry; it's also municipalities, and they're also funded a certain way. So everybody has to understand that if this is going to happen, it's going to take money, and it's going to have to be able to. That will be the one that will kill any idea going forward. And I think we're aware of it. We deal with it. The board is very, we are tight with money. Budgeting is always a problem for us as they're shrinking dollars. The ministry is squeezing the boards with removing their top-up funding. It's forcing us more and more to the potential of partnerships to help pay for this empty space. So they're pushing us towards that. It's just finding a suitable partner that has the money to be able to contribute in the way they do. And the thing that we have to also understand, it's got to be for the long term. It can't be a 1 or 2 year solution because, that ends in that short of time. We're back to square one with an empty school and have all the challenges we have. So it has to be sustainable. It has to be long term. It has to be a good business case. And I think we're open to it. I think we understand it. We just need to work with the community organizations and have them understand. I think that's the whole thing that they're trying to do is let's get talking about this now, give lots of notice and see what we can build. I think for the school boards, a thing that we're struggling with a little bit with these community partnerships is that we're not a year-round 24/7 operation. So again, for us to be the major landlords, we have to reinvent ourselves as well because we're not open on weekends. A lot of the community organizations are happening open weekends. So we also have to understand how this all works and adapt to this. And that's what we're working on now and as we work forward to it. But I think we're committed to it. I think the ministry forced us to be committed to us by reducing our funding. And I think, collectively the trustees feel, any use of the infrastructure for the community good is a good thing to do. We just have to find the right partners and the right scenario to deliver that. Yes?
The time frame for a pilot?
Good question. We'll talk a little bit about the timing. We're in the first cycle of this. So the first thing the board has to do within this first year, as per our procedure, is have one of these annual meetings, or have the annual meetings, produce all the documentation. This isn't new. We have been circulating unused space and potential collaborations for a number of years, but not in this way. It would just go out in a memo and not really have a dialogue. So it's stepping that up. We do get inquiries. We have community organizations. We have community hubs. In the City of London and some of the other municipalities, some of our schools, we have different partnership arrangements happening. So it's not new to us. We have the agreements in place. Even our daycare operations are similar to that type of setup. But they're really trying to, to amp it up and make sure that, that the dialogue is happening well in advance. So we're basically into the first cycle of that now. Yes?
You mentioned the notification process, and the board may add other entities to contact. Has TVDSB identified any of those other entities at this time?
What we have in our initial circulation process, which what will happen on Thursday, we have one of these meetings for not only school councils and school council reps and principals, but also one for municipalities and one for community organizations. We have added to our list any organization that we presently have an agreement with that are in our schools outside of those ones. So we have added those to our list initially. There's also a process in our procedure in which an entity may want to get added to the list. You can submit your information so that we can add you to the notification list, and that's all part of the procedure, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes. So basically the answer is yes. It's outside of just the entities that they've identified in the guidelines. We've already expanded it for our initial list that we're putting through the procedure right now. And I would hope that list grows. I think as this gets out and people understand what we're trying to do, the opportunities that present themselves, that maybe there's community organizations or partners that would like to be notified about all the information that we're trying to share, and also give us their information. If I could move on, then we'll start with the next one, which is another guideline. And again, these are just guidelines, so we're just dealing with what the ministry has asked us to do. And that's the pupil accommodation review. And this really is the ARC process. So the purpose of the guideline is to provide a framework of minimum standards for school boards to undertake pupil accommodation reviews. So they're giving us the minimum standards. So everything we talk about today will be in this guideline will be minimum. When you go to our procedure, we'll see we've exceeded the minimum in a number of issues, and we'll explain that to you when we get to it. The ministry is committed that decisions are made with the involvement of a well-informed local community. So they want to make sure that the community understands all aspects of what the board's doing, and it'll become very apparent how that has changed in the processes they're requiring us to do. And based on a broad range of criteria regarding the quality of the learning experience, we can never lose sight of the fact that job one is student achievement and student education. I mean, we have to keep that in the forefront of all decision making, and that will be a theme throughout the whole procedure as we work through it. The boards are responsible for creating and implementing a policy to address pupil accommodation reviews to serve their local needs. So we do have some leeway in developing our own policy and procedure, and you'll see how we've done that. And consulting with local communities prior to adopting and amending their pupil accommodation review process. And basically that's what we're here tonight for, to reach out to you, give you an understanding of what's happening, but also giving the public input on our policy and procedure for 90 days to have input back from it. Pupil accommodation review policies, we're going to share relevant information and providing the opportunities for the public and affected school communities to be heard. So the ministry is saying you have to find a way for the school communities to speak. And make sure that's included in your policy. Before school boards, prior to an accommodation review, boards are to have a long-term capital and accommodation plan, which includes all relevant information obtained from local municipal governments and community partners, hence the other procedure, which we're reaching out to them to talk to them in advance. Long-term enrollment projections, which we do annually. Opportunities for an effective use of space. So we want to make sure that the space is being effectively used. When we establish an accommodation review, the ministry is asking us, do we have to have supporting rationale? You have to have a recommended option. The Thames Valley Board in the past always had a recommended option, but a lot of the boards in the province, when they went to an ARC, did not have a recommended option. They just said, what do you think? That's no longer acceptable. You have to tell the community what you're thinking of doing. A timeline for implementation of the recorded, so we have to lay out what the timing will be, and we have to create school information profiles for the schools affected to be able to compare school to school. Methods of consultation. The ministry is really pushing the boards to ensure that there's proper consultation. So we have the ARC committee. That will be one form of consulting. The second one, we have a special process in which we're going to be consulting through the ARC process with municipal governments and community organizations, which is their own separate process to communicate with us. We're going to have public meetings. All the meetings in the ARCs will be public. And we also have now the ministry, although we always did in the past, the ministry is making all boards have an opportunity for public delegations directly to the trustees. We did that in the past, so it's not a change for us, but now there's mandating it to all the boards in the province. And really an important slide, this is the role of the Accommodation Review Committee, and the role has changed. And the first one is, it's the official conduit for information shared between the board and the school community. So this is how we're going to communicate with our school communities, the use of the ARC, and get their input back. The ARCs do not need to achieve consensus regarding the information provided to the trustees. So with your input coming back, you don't have to consensus, you don't have to write a report that everybody agrees to, you just have to tell us or tell the trustees what your school community feels about the recommendations. And you could have it as, a percentage of this feels this way, you could have different points of view. We just need to get feedback. We need to understand how the school community is feeling about this recommendation. This is, again, there's no report, there's no consensus on it. Membership includes at the ARC, and this is also a change, minimum is parents and guardian representatives from each of the schools under review. So the ministry say you just have to have parents and guardians. They no longer require us to have municipal representation. They no longer require us to have community representation. It's really they want to hear from the parents and guardians. There's another process for the municipalities and the public to be able to delegate and discuss to the board. And they have to follow the terms of reference that we lay out. So that is the role of the ARC committee. The next one is boards are required to develop school information profiles for each school under review, which includes facility profile, instructional profile, community use profile, and other school use profile. A major change, this was always a requirement before for boards to do school information profile, but the ministry has removed all subjective information. They're no longer asking us how the value of the community, school to the community, which is impossible to be able to value from any perspective. All this information that's required for the school information profile now is quantitative and backed on numbers or financial statements or enrollment projections, but it's no longer subjective type of comments that really didn't cause any was hard to garner, hard to be able to establish from an administrative point of view. And I think the other subjective type of comments will come through the public input as well as the delegations to the board. This is the part of it as well that we're talking about, the special process for municipalities. The school boards must inform affected single and upper-tier municipalities and community organizations that we talked about on that list to discuss the comment on the recommended options of the initial staff report. We have to go to those people before or just after the board has said they're going to do an ARC and have another meeting with them to say we are doing an ARC. This is your role and responsibility throughout the ARC, and we'll talk about it in a minute, but they have a special role to play in the accommodation process, the pupil accommodation process. And those, again, are the entities that we talked about on the list as well as municipalities. Public meetings. We're now only required to have 2 public meetings. It used to be 4 plus 1 under the old guidelines for the broader community consultation of the initial staff report. We are to provide an overview of the ARC orientation session, so we've got to explain at the public meeting how we've oriented the ARC members, and we have to also have a presentation initial staff report including recommended options and school information profiles. That has to happen at the public meetings. To complete the accommodation report after the public meetings, there's a final staff report. So after we go through the process, after we have the initial staff report, hear all the consultations, we produce another report It may be the same option, it may be adjusted or modified from the input, but we produce the final staff report. The ministry is now saying you have to have delegations to the Board of Trustees, mandating the boards to have a night that the public can come and talk to the trustees, and then there's the decision of the board. Another thing that they have now mandated through the guidelines is that we have to have transition planning. We have to be very transparent in the process to be carried out in consultation with parents and guardians. So we have to have input and discussions with the parents and guardians that are affected, the students being adjusted through the accommodation process. And boards are expected to establish a separate committee to address the transition of students and staff. And that is now required by the ministry. To go through the timelines of the process, and this is where the ministry has looked at, and this is a drastic change, from the time the trustee approval to conduct a pupil accommodation review, to the notice and decision of the affected municipalities, the first public meeting, the final public meeting, the final staff report, the public delegation, and the final decision of the trustees, the minimum number of days to accomplish that is 100 days. And if you're familiar with some of the other ARC processes that were 16, 18 months long, this is much more compressed now, and the ministry has indicated that's the minimum amount of days you have to conduct an ARC, using all their required time between. There still is exemptions that the ministry allows us to not have to do an ARC. One is a replacement school to be built on the existing site or required in the existing attendance area. That was there before. A lease or a school is terminated. You don't have to do an ARC. Relocation of grades or program enrollment constitute less than 50% of the school's enrollment. If you move grades out or adjust grades or grade structure or programs, and it doesn't constitute 50% of the enrollment, you do not have to do an ARC. When repairing or renovating a school and the school community must be temporarily relocated, an ARC is not required. A facility has been serving as a holding school, and again, we'll be talking about holding zones later on, an ARC is not required. And when there's no students enrolled at a school at any time throughout the year, and this is a situation that happens in Northern Ontario where they just have no students left in the school, there's no requirement to do an ARC with respect to keeping that school closed. It doesn't really affect Thames Valley. This is the guidelines that we are to work with in developing our own new procedure with respect to the accommodation review. Again, there's some major changes. The timing's quite condensed. Membership's different. The ARC is no longer required to produce a report. They act as a conduit of information. And again, there's a different process involved for municipalities and community organizations to be able to give input to the board, but not directly to the ARC, or not sit on the ARC committee. I'd be pleased to take any questions with respect to this guideline. Yes?
With regard to the two public meetings, I know through the ARC process, community people were very interested in hearing all of the information before giving their public input. So is there a way to get that information out at the beginning when we're working with a very tight time frame?
We, again, not to go ahead of the lesson, but we didn't stick with 2 public meetings, we went to 3.
Thank you.
And for that very reason, so that we have more opportunities for public consultation and presentations to the ARC before they have to make their final report. So just to go to, we have 3, they can have presentations at the first and second, but they can't have it on the final. They want to have all the information ahead of time before they have to come and write their final report or come to what the community input they required. So we saw that as a flaw, and we really wanted to have it up front so they have it to work with it. And it's not only community organizations, it's not only municipalities and the community organizations, but it's also the public can go and do that directly to the ARC committee. So we'll talk about that when we get to the process, but we did recognize that as a potential problem of how we're going to get community input to the ARC committee members in a timely fashion. Yes, at the back.
Does every school have a school information profile whether or not they're involved in an ARC?
No. Only schools involved in an ARC will create a school information profile. It's quite extensive with respect to the information, but it's really to be used by the ARC committees to compare one school versus the other, and not so much to stack up against, but to understand what's happening at school from a year built, square footage to programs offered to staff in the school. There'll be information with respect to operating costs, from heating utilities to staffing costs. There's how much community use is in the school, how many hours of community use the gyms will be putting through. There's probably at least 30 or 40, I would think, Brooke, entry points that we have to produce for the school information profile, but it's really, they are really developed just for the ARC process.
So they be made available to the board as well as the community?
Actually, they have to be produced for our report to the board to start the ARC. The school information profiles have to be included at the beginning of the ARC process. So the trustees will see them before they even make a decision going forward. So it's all very transparent now. All the information is required up front now to do an ARC. It's no longer, and we used to be guilty of this, we bring different information throughout the ARC process. What we have to do now is have all the information available to the trustees prior to making a decision if they even want to do an ARC. That requires more lead-in time on our part administratively to have it ready, but it does give them the full range of information they require to make an informed decision if there is merit in starting down the road of discussing consolidations of schools. Yes?
You say that there's delegations that will go to the Board of Trustees. In your on-staff report, who are those delegates that will speak to the trustees?
Anybody that wants to. It's an open delegation. Not only can the ARC members speak, community organization, municipalities, but any member of the public can come to the trustees prior to them making a final decision and speak to the Board of Trustees directly, not through any other avenue, but directly to the trustees. So once the final ARC report is posted, and the presentation is done at the board, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that they can then see the report and decide if they want to have their time with the trustees to give them their input and their insight into the recommendation. So it's open to everybody and anybody to come. There's a process to sign up, but there is a process for them to speak to it.
Is there a risk though that you'll have, say, the local minority get, a loud voice that would drown out any recommendations that might be made in the prior process that is taking place?
That's the public process. Everybody has a right to speak. So yes, there is that possibility, and it's up to the trustees, I think, to understand, they see the business case, understand the input received through the ARC process and the community organization process, but also the delegation process, and then it's totally up to them to make the final decision with all the information they've gotten. But the thing that I think is more important now in the process is that the input will be, it's more organized for them, and it's more directed towards them. We don't have the trustees actually part of the ARC, so they're not on the ARC committees. They're ex-official, but they're not in the ARC committees. This is for them to sit back and listen to everything and then make the decision based on all the information at the end of the process. Yes?
Is it a less cumbersome process to speak as part of the public as in one of the meetings?
The delegation meetings?
Yes.
No, it's the same process. That's by board bylaw. So you do have to get a presenter's package. You have to sign up 8 days in advance. No, it's the same. You get 5 and 10. That's part of our board bylaws. So we're following the board bylaws with respect to public delegations. Yes?
Can a community member sit on the ARC if you can't get parent or guardian representation?
No. The procedure only allows for parents and guardians to sit on the ARC.
So what's the alternative for a school that can't get that?
We go with less members on the ARC. But again, this is the guideline. I wanted to explain the guideline. I think there's more detail with respect to the process, and you'll see how many parents are involved once we get to our actual procedure. But I thought it was important to set the stage of what the ministry expected from the boards and where we got some of these ideas that we have to follow. We haven't dreamt some of these up. We're trying to follow the processes. So if you let me get to the actual pupil accommodation procedure that we've developed, it may answer some of your questions or alleviate some of your concerns with respect to that, because as I mentioned, we went to more community meetings, so on and so forth.